Hi everyone, good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, Preventing Sexual Abuse at Overnight Camps. Today's webinar is hosted by JOFA, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, and is the latest installment in our webinar series which began 2 years ago. My name is Rachel Lieberman, I'm the Assistant Director at JOFA, and I'm very excited to welcome you all today. One housekeeping note before we begin. There is a link to a question form in the first line of the description underneath this video. If you have any questions for our presenters, please feel free to submit them throughout the webinar using this form, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. Sending your child to sleepaway camp requires parents to place a high degree of trust in the camps to guard their children's safety. On this afternoon's webinar, our presenters will be discussing what steps parents can take in order to feel more confident that their children will be in safe environments that have protocols in place to prevent sexual abuse. Our presenter, Rahel Bayar, is a child abuse and sex crimes prosecutor in New York. She has consulted for both camps and synagogues on creating safety protocols and effective staff training. She is the former head of staff of Camp Mosheva Malibu, where she pioneered a staff training program on understanding abuse within a camp setting. And this summer, she will be returning as a camp parent, helping to bridge the gap between effective staff training and an impactful and safe camper experience. Our moderator, Rabbi Menachem Hecht, serves as Executive Director of Bnei Akiva of Los Angeles, where he oversees the Mosheva California overnight camp, year-round Bnei Akiva youth programming, and the Dovid Oved Retreat Center. Menachem was previously the founding director of the popular Mosheva Bayar day camps in New Jersey and Toronto, and he has also served as assistant director of Bnei Akiva of the US and Canada. He spent many years as a counselor, division head, education director, and head counselor at Camp Stone in Sugar Grove, Pennsylvania. I'd also like to note that Rahel and Menachem play very different roles at camp. Rahel is serving as a camp parent with professional expertise in preventing child abuse, and Menachem is the camp professional. However, they're working together to develop clear lines of communication before the summer starts and before a crisis arises. It's important for all of us to remember that everyone is on the same team, the counselors, the parents, and the camp professionals, with the shared goal of keeping campers safe and making sure they have the best summer ever. We must all strive to keep this in mind, particularly in times of crisis and uncertainty, and to develop open lines of communication and positive working relationships before moments of crisis, so that in the event of an incident, parents, educators, and administrators will be able to build on those relationships to respond to any incidents that arise at camp. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to our panelists.
Okay, thank you so much, Rachel. It's great to be here together with Rahel. We have a little bit less than an hour, and Rahel and I are going to divide the time into 4 sections. We're first going to talk about the nature and scope of the problem. What is it that parents and camp professionals should be concerned about in this area? Then we're going to talk a bit about what responsible camps do or can do to address the problem and mitigate the problem. And we're going to talk about what parents can do. And then we're going to respond to questions. And as Rachel said, questions can be asked in writing throughout the program. Okay, I have a whole bunch of years of experience setting up day camps and overnight camps. That's what I've been doing for the last 10 years or so. And so this is an issue which is really important to me in the context of a whole constellation of other safety concerns and safety issues. Rahel brings to the table a particular expertise in sex abuse and sex crimes. And so, the first question that I would pose to Rahel is, can you give us some insight into in what ways you see sex abuse as something which is similar to and different from other kinds of safety issues that parents and children might encounter at camp?
Sure. Thank you, Menachem, and thank you, Rachel, and it's really great to be here. You know, in dealing with the question of how are sex crimes or sexual crimes against children different from other types of crimes, it's really important to remember that when it comes to sex crimes specifically and the way that children can be abused in that way, it's typically not a stranger. This concept of a stranger, a scary person that's walking down the street that might be, you know, completely could grab a kid overnight or in the middle of the day is really not what we're talking about. We're talking about people that have trust relationships with kids. We're talking about people that your kids love and learn to love. They're people that develop wonderful relationships with them. And when I say wonderful, I don't mean that they're positive relationships. I mean that that's how it's categorized. And so you're talking about a type of crime where you may not see it coming. It's not the creepy person that's sitting in the corner. It's not the scary person on the street. And so when you have that knowledge and you are aware of that fact, it empowers you as a parent to know that you have to talk to your kid about why this might be a different type of crime. In addition, when it comes to people who commit sex crimes, it's typically built on these concepts called grooming or secrecy. The idea that it's an adult or an older child who will develop a secret with your child that will groom them, will gift them things, will make them indebted to them in a very specific way. It's a very slow process before a sex crime is actually committed when it comes to children. And so if you're aware of what it is that you can look for, if you're aware of what it is that that draws kids into that, you're empowered to stop it before it even starts. You know, physical abuse or bullying, they always feel bad. And with sex abuse, I always say to parents, you have to remember that you can't use the language of it's guaranteed to feel bad, because not all sex crimes feel physically bad. And I know that's a really uncomfortable thing for us to think about, and it's an uncomfortable thing for us to wrap our minds around. But at the end of the day, if you're trying to differentiate between what the difference is between one type of crime and a sex crime, it's that it's hard to categorize it as something that will always feel bad, because that's not necessarily the case. And I think the last thing that really differentiates sex crimes or sex crimes against children is the fact that kids typically are very, very scared and very intimidated to disclose anything that happens to them. And we're going to talk a little bit later about things as parents that we can do to ensure that our kids feel that there's a safe space to speak about this stuff. But in general, kids that are not given the proper skill set to understand why there's an issue may not have that proper skill set to know that they can even disclose something. Kids hate to disappoint their parents. And a lot of the way that sex crimes or people who perpetrate sex crimes function is by shaming kids and making them believe that they absolutely cannot tell anyone, because if they do, the child who's disclosing will destroy someone's life. And that's a huge, impactful weight for any child, no matter what age, to carry on their shoulders. No kid wants their parent to be angry at them. I'm
asking now as a camp director, but the truth is that it's not fundamentally a different question for a camp parent. In terms of looking at setting up protocols and procedures at a camp, do you believe, or is it your recommendation that we should assume that there are predators or criminals or perpetrators of ill intent who are part of our camp community?
I'm going to answer with a yes and a caveat. I'm answering with a yes because I think it's good to go into a situation saying to yourself, this can happen at my camp. This can happen in my community. This can happen with kids that I know. This can happen with my child. But not because we're terrified and not because we're scared, but because one of the goals of picking the right camp, one of the goals of empowering and educating our kids and ourselves is to make our kids tough targets, to make our camps tough targets. If every single camp took the attitude that, you know what, we could have someone in our midst. There could be a counselor here that may have these intentions and may try to do this. I'm going to make it clear as the camp director during staff training, this is not happening at our camp. You make your camp a tough target. And it's the same thing for parents with kids. If your kid walks into a place and already knows, and we're going to, again, get to some of these skill sets and some of these tools later on in the talk, already knows that they can't keep secrets, already knows that this is something that I can talk about with my parents. I don't have to be ashamed and I don't have to be embarrassed. I'm empowered. Those kids become tough targets. And that's what you want. You want this mentality of, you're not going to do this at my camp. You're not going to do this with my kid. Move on. Because if everybody had that attitude, if everybody took that approach, instead of being scared that it might happen at our camp or with our kid, we'd be empowered to say, it's not happening here. So, Menachem, yes, I think you should make the assumption that there will be someone in your midst. I think the statistics, show that there are typically lots of situations where there are, and I think it's the best attitude to go into prevention with.
Right, I hear you. Before we move on to talking about what camps should be doing to set themselves up responsibly, to prevent these kinds of things from happening, are there any other elements to the problem? Do you see, is sexual abuse or sexual molestation something that you see exclusively as a problem of criminal behavior, or are there other manifestations that we should be thinking of?
Well, when you say, is this exclusively a problem of criminal behavior, do you mean specifically with people that are criminals?
Well, I guess there are a few different directions that we can take this. What I'm curious about in particular is, I think that parents tend to think about sexual abuse as a problem that we have to worry about in terms of adults, like inflicting on kids. But as a camp director and someone who's sort of seen issues play out, let's say over the last 10 years in a variety of different camps, the question I have is, how do camper-to-camper relationships play out here?
So I think it's important, both as a camp director and also as camp parents, that we understand that it could absolutely be a counselor or somebody on staff that could potentially do something to your child, but there is also going to be an issue of something that could be camper-to-camper related. You have campers of all different ages. You have 7- and 8-year-olds, and you have 15- and 16-year-olds. And that doesn't mean that we need to categorize a child in a specific criminal way if they do something, but at the same time, it's important to remember that as you're talking to kids about this, and as a camp director, you're dealing with your staff, one of the ways that you want to acknowledge this issue and also work to prevent this issue in your camp is to recognize that there absolutely could be a camper-to-camper situation. You could have a situation where you have a lot of kids in a bunk at night. If your counselors are not in the bunk, what happens then? Could you have a situation where one child jumps on another child in a sexual way? Absolutely. Could you have a situation in a shower room where you have somebody that opens up the shower door and tries to take a picture? Absolutely. These are things that absolutely happen in camp, and that's part of what we need to prevent, because it's not just a staff camper issue, it is also a camper issue. We need to give our kids the tools to understand that this is not acceptable behavior in camp. We need to give our staff the understanding of how to stop it if they see it, and what to do and what not to do. And we as parents also need to be able to have frank conversations with our kids about what all of this means. Sometimes people call it hazing, sometimes people call it abuse. I would categorize it pretty much in the level of abuse. You don't want a situation where someone is snapping a picture of your child naked, and neither does the camp.
Right. Okay. Thank you. That's really helpful. And I think let's now, having a sense of the scope of the problem, let's move into the second part of the conversation, which is, what are the protocols that responsible overnight camps should have in place to prevent abuse? We actually just got a question that came in. If a camp or youth organization has a history of a past scandal, would you still consider sending your kids there? How do you vet a camp that may have a few blemishes on its record? I'll let you answer, but before I do, to me, the first step would be that I don't think it's fundamentally different in terms of the questions that you ask or the vetting that you do, regardless of whether a camp has blemishes in its staff. I spent a lot of time over the course of the year traveling from town to town, from city to city, having conversations with parents at open houses and at parlor meetings in people's living rooms, and I always enjoy having conversations with educated consumers. I always appreciate it when parents are coming in having really thought about what it is that they're looking for and having a clear sense of what they expect of a camp. So, the next set of questions that we're going to talk about, I think, are relevant for me as a camp director in terms of what should the camp look like and what protocols should we have in place. But I think it's an identical set of questions that parents can have in their toolbox to approach camp directors with. I think that the first set of questions is around who is part of the camp community. And so what I would now turn to you, Rahel, with is, what do you see as the right kinds of concerns to have around hiring staff?
Well, I just want to take it back a second and say that I'm going to answer that question that just came in. I think that answering that question after we have this part of the conversation may make a lot more sense. So I am going to touch upon that issue of what happens if a camp does have a past blemish. But with regard to, the kinds of questions that you should be asking of a camp director, and Menachem's here speaking as a camp director, before you even get to the types of questions, as a parent, what I want to say to you is this: do not be concerned about being that parent. And I think you know what I mean when I say that parent. In a day and age of helicopter parenting and all of these, concepts of when should we overstep and when should we not overstep and what should we do and what should we say, and are we protecting our child? Are we, empowering our child? What are we doing? I want you to take all of that and put it out of your mind. Because I can guarantee you right now, before you ask a camp director any of these questions, you should be aware of the fact that you are your best advocate and you are your child's best advocate. You are the only one that can ensure that when you do send your kid there, these questions have been answered. And so when you turn to the camp director and you have a list of questions to go through, if the camp director responds to you in the opposite way that Menachem just responded, right? Menachem was excited about being engaged by parents. He wants them to know that this camp is safe. He wants them to know that it's okay to ask these questions. If the camp director that you're speaking to gives you the brush off or gets very concerned about the questions you're asking, or you feel doesn't take it seriously, you may need to second guess whether that's a camp that you want to send your child to. That's the first thing. With regard to hiring specifically, Menachem, was that your question with regard to hiring?
Yeah.
Okay. So with regard to hiring specifically, here are the questions that I ask and the reasons why I recommend them. First and foremost, do you do background checks on every staff member? And I mean background checks. Do you do background checks? Do you check the sex offender registry in that state? Do you check the sex offender registry nationally? Why or why not? Now, a lot of times I get people responding to me saying, okay, but 17, 18, 19-year-olds, you're going to do a background check, and chances are it's going to come back clean. And my response is, that is correct. That is a first step. A camp that takes their staffing seriously enough to do background checks and to check sex offender registry websites, it means they take this seriously. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is, what kind of interview process do you have for your staff? Do you meet them in person so that you can get a sense of who they are? Do you do a Skype interview or a FaceTime interview? Do you make sure that there is some sort of FaceTime where you can have a conversation with that staff member, you as the camp director or the staff person hiring? How much time do you as a camp invest in getting to know your staff before they come? Because sometimes it's a gut feeling about someone, sometimes it's something that they say, sometimes that's something that you can't get off of an application or a piece of paper. So what kind of an interview process do you do with your staff? What kind of questions do you ask them? Do you talk to them at all during the interview process about child safety? Do you tell them it's a really important part of your camp, and have they ever had any issues before with any child safety issues? Now, you know, I have parents that say to me all the time, okay, but staff can lie about that. That's true. They can lie about anything. But you as the director are holding them accountable, and you're sending the first message. We take this seriously, and this is not going to happen in our camp. And that's important for parents to know. After that interview process and the questions, the last piece of that hiring process that I would ask a camp director is, do you check their references? You know, on most camp applications, people have to give 3 to 5 references, and they give them, and they give email addresses. But how many times does the camp completely skip over the process of actually getting a reference? Doing a potential Facebook check, seeing, you know what, let me reach out and see if this person really did work at this camp last summer and why they don't want to go back there. What kind of reference check do you do for your staff? And again, all of these are questions you're asking the camp director because you want to know that they care about this issue as much as you do as a parent.
Great. Okay, so we've gotten through the first step. We, as a camp, have gone through the hiring process. We've interviewed, we've done criminal background checks, we've done personal background checks, and the staff arrive at camp. What are the questions that camp parents should be thinking about in terms of what staff training should look like to prevent sex abuse?
Well, I think that, you know, there are a litany of questions that you can ask that camp director about training. But I think that it all, again, comes from this same concept. Do you make this a priority in your camp? So the first question that I typically would say to a parent to ask is, what kind of training do you do with your counselors? Tell me about your safety training. I want to hear about it. Who is the person that you bring in, or the people that you bring in to deal with physical abuse and sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, bullying? Is this a half-an-hour session that you do during a whole 1-week thing? Is it an hour session? Do you have multiple sessions that you split up? Do you do training for the whole camp together? Do you divide by age groups? Tell me about it. Don't just tell me you do it. Tell me why it's significant. Tell me why it works, and tell me when it's been done in the past, what was good and what was bad about it. I want to know. And the reason why you're asking all of these detailed questions is because you do want to know. You want to know that this isn't going to be a half-an-hour to 45-minute session late on Saturday night, the night before the campers are coming, when every single staff member just wants to go to Walmart or Target because they've been in staff training for a week and they have got to get out before the campers come. And I've been there, and I know that. That's not the time for this. The time for this is throughout the entire staff training session. Obviously, if you have a 3-day training, it's not going to necessarily be every single day. But if you have a long 1-week session, you want to know that this is a priority. You want to know that there are professional people that are coming in to train them on how to deal with these situations. Not only on what to do if they suspect something is happening, what to do if they see something happening, what to do if they overhear a child disclose something happening, what to do if they find out that their best friend in camp, a fellow staff member, may be doing something themselves. You have to arm your staff, and you do that with training and empowering them to deal with the situation. You know, the other types of training issues that come up is, and as a parent that you should be asking the director is, depending on your camp, tell me about how you train on your shmirah policy. Now, a lot of camps call this something different, but I use the term shmirah policy. It's the one that I'm familiar with. It's what happens at night when the counselors leave the bunks and there's a check of staff that goes around. Is there a counselor that's always in the bunk with the kids? Are there counselors that walk around at night to check each bunk every 15 minutes? What are the protocols that you've put in place in staff training to explain the importance of your policy about nighttime checks? What do you do if it's violated? How do you make sure the kids are safe? How do you make sure the staff is safe? Is there ever a situation where a counselor would be walking alone into a bunk with a child that might be by themselves. Tell me about how you train your counselors in this way.
Yeah, so that's a really helpful example. And I think that you're in a unique position as somebody who thinks about this as a prosecutor, but also really understands the inner workings of camp, because you've got this deep experience as a leader in overnight summer camp. Can you point to a few other sort of specific risk areas in camp that the parents can have in mind and can potentially ask as direct questions to camp directors?
Sure. I mean, I think that there are a few different issues, right? There are a few different areas that they can direct to those camp directors, which is, there are vulnerable places in camp. There's changing for swimming, and there are showers, and there are bathrooms, and sometimes there are bathrooms in bunks and showers in bunks, and sometimes there are, as we used to affectionately call them, outhouses that are really just shower houses and toilets, and lots of people using them at the same time. So ask your camp director, first of all, what is the situation with bathrooms and with showering? I remember one summer that I was a counselor on staff, and they had ordered all these shower curtains for the shower houses, and they were accidentally see-through. They had, instead of ordering white ones, ordered completely see-through shower curtains. And this was before the days of Amazon, right? This was before the days of being able to just go on and order something and have it there within 2 days. And there was a crisis. What do we do? And I still remember that there was one staff member who said, well, we'll just put them up. It's fine. People will just shower and it'll be see-through. That's what you don't want. You want someone as a camp director who's going to recognize that that is not appropriate, and that lends itself to a very, very inappropriate situation. So ask the questions. How are showering done? Is there ever going to be a situation, if there are shower houses, where there aren't staff members monitoring it? One of the things that we instituted a few years ago in shower houses is that there had to be at least 2 to 3 staff members in the shower houses while anybody was showering, to monitor what was going on and to make sure that no one counselor was there alone with kids. And those are the types of questions that you want to ask with regard to specific places.
One of the points that you made early in the conversation, which I thought was really central to thinking about this as a whole, is that what distinguishes sex abuse from other kinds of safety issues or other kinds of abuse or violence is that it often comes from a nurturing or trusting source, or a trusted source. With that in mind, what would you recommend that camps have in place in terms of reporting? In other words, the first natural person that a camper would go to if something happens that makes them uncomfortable might be the very person who is the perpetrator.
Right. So, one question, I'm going to answer your question, but I want to also point this out to the parents that are watching this and listening to this. It is very scary to send your kid to a camp knowing that they're not going to have access to cell phones and that they're not going to have access to you all the time. And so Menachem's question is very applicable to a camp setting, which is, I'm sending my kid into a situation where they can't call me if something happens. They can't tell me. How do I know that this camp is going to provide a safe person? And so one of the things that I recommend is that a camp, and that you can ask your camp director if they do this, appoint multiple safety people that are on staff. Now, it could be a combination of a division head, a doctor, a nurse, a camp mom, a camp dad, meaning the camp parent. It could be the camp social worker, the camp psychologist. It could be, the music teacher, whoever it might be. There should be at least 3 point people on staff that kids are told that they can go to if there is something that they want to disclose, or if there's something they're concerned about. I call these people the safety point people. I'm sure there's a more creative name, but I think it's the most effective way of conveying it. And the reason why you want to have multiple safety point people in camp is because you want to ensure that a kid can go to one. And if they're not heard by that one person, they can go to another. And if they're not heard by that person, they can go to another. You also want to make sure to give kids enough of an option that they'll feel comfortable going to someone. And as parents, one of the things that I recommend is after you find out from the director who those safety point people are in camp, take your kids on the camp website. Point out the picture of those safety point people to your kids before they go to camp. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you talk to your kid without scaring them in a little bit. But one of the things you can do is say, look, you know, you're going to have counselors and you're going to have a division head. But there are also these 3 people listed on the website. Here's this person's picture and name. Here's this person's picture and name. If there's ever anything that you want to talk about, if there's ever anything that you are really worried about or you think is unsafe, these are the people that you go to. And then you want to ensure that as a director, you are making that clear, not only during staff training to your staff, but at the very beginning of camp. When you introduce the rules to your kids, the campers in camp, you also want to point out the safety point people, and you want to keep pointing it out. You don't just think that that one 15-minute time period where you go through fire safety and, you know, potential intruder safety and all of that stuff that first night of camp when kids are homesick and crazy and scared and excited and bouncing off the walls, that that's the only time you should point out the safety point people. Your division head should know that, and they should remind the kids. Your counselors should know that. And you as the camp director should make it clear. It may be as simple as making an announcement over the loudspeaker in the morning saying, and the safety point people will be in the office between the hours of, 9 and 10. Or just know that safety point person A is off and out of camp today and somebody else will be taking their place. Don't make it scary. Make it something that's part of the camp culture. And that will not only, as parents, make you feel better that your kid has someone to go to, but also as a camp director to know that you are creating an environment of accountability.
Okay. I love the safety point person concept.
Thank you.
And it's not one that I've seen in a lot of camps. So I think what you're bringing up is something that absolutely should be thought about and implemented across the field. This is a great transition to the third part of the conversation, which to me is the one which is most interesting, which is now having this richer sense of what camps should be doing to be responsible in this area. What can we as parents do? How do you recommend that we talk to our kids about inappropriate and potentially abusive behavior at camp? How do we make them informed and make them empowered without frightening them out of the concept of coming over at camp entirely?
It's a great question, and it's actually the question I get the most, which is, how do I realistically have these conversations with my kids without scaring them and making them think that everybody is bad, that there are really, really scary people out there? This is a conversation that is very applicable and specific to a camp environment where you're sending your kid away. But I have to start by saying, the conversation starts with you as parents. It starts with us as parents. It starts with an acknowledgement that this is very scary because as adults and as parents, we read the headlines. We know the reality out there. And our kids may not read the headlines and may not understand the reality out there. So it really starts with a shift in the way that parents and the way that we think, which is, this does not have to be scary. This can be an opportunity to teach my child, to empower my child, to show them that this is so important, and I'm going to do this with as much care as I would do when it comes to teaching them fire safety or water safety or anything of that sort. So before you can even sit down and talk with your kids, you cannot approach it from fear. You can't sit down with your kid and say, okay, there are really bad people and they're going to do really bad things, and if someone tries to touch you, you have to tell someone. That is not what you want to do. But you have to be comfortable as a parent having this conversation with your kid. And that means that you got to psych yourself into it, and you got to say to yourself, okay, I'm going to have this conversation, and I'm going to do it from a place of positivity. But it's also...
Sorry for interrupting.
No,
one
that's
of the things that I often talk about when I'm talking to parents about camp is that camp is a wonderful place for children to learn to advocate for themselves, where they're in a position where for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 7 weeks, they have to learn to speak up because their parents aren't, around the corner, and aren't there to, to get things for them. Do you see this conversation about sex abuse as primarily about helping our children learn to advocate for themselves?
I think it's different. I mean, I think that the whole concept of camp and empowering your child and making sure that they have a really, active voice is a very important concept. It's one of the reasons why I believe that camp is so important and integral. But sexual abuse is a very pervasive issue. And saying to a kid, I'm going to empower you, or trying to empower them to speak up in a situation where they are being not only manipulated, but incredibly confused and being abused and damaged, is putting the pressure on them to have to stop the situation. And that is not appropriate, and that is not fair. So when I use the concept of empowering our kids to have the tools to deal with what happens if somebody tries to victimize them or their friends, it's a tool. It's our best form of prevention. But at the same time, empowering kids to speak up and have a voice, and not understanding the serious implications of what it means to be targeted by somebody with a sex offense or a sex offender, it is a distinction that we really need to make. Let's not make this our kids' responsibility. Let's give them the tools so that we can send them out in the world and really hope that they remember what it is that we taught them. And Menachem, it's a really good question that you ask, because one of the issues that parents always say to me is, okay, so now I'm going to sit down and I'm going to have this big conversation with my kid. And my answer to that is, no, you're not. This is not a conversation that is a, come on guys, come on into the living room, we need to sit down and have a family meeting, I'm going to talk to you about something very important. Instead, the way to prepare your kid to deal with this, the way to give them the really good tools, is to make this a constant conversation. This is the conversation you have with your kids while you're making dinner and they're doing their homework. This is the conversation you have with your kids while you're making sure that they got all the shampoo out of their hair in the shower. This is the conversation you have before they go to sleep, or when you're walking to synagogue, or when you're taking them to the bus stop. It's constant. You need to remind them of many, many things. And on some level, I liken it to the fact that when I'm walking with my 4-year-olds anywhere, if we get to a street, I always say to her, okay, now what do? We look both ways? Do you see any cars? Do you hear any cars? Okay, is it safe to cross the street? I don't sit her down and say, okay, a car could hit you and therefore you must look both ways. And that's what I mean by a constant conversation. Don't make this awkward. Don't make this huge. It's awkward for you as a parent, but it doesn't have to be for your child.
So what, I love the analogy of crossing the street. And I think the language there is clear. It's something that we all grow up with. Can you sort of walk us through what are the elements of this
Sure.
conversation?
I think that there are 4 aspects to this conversation. And again, remember, it's really important that this be a constant dialogue in your family. And I think that the 4 aspects are the language that you choose to use, the rules that you choose to implement, the body rules, the concept of dealing with secrets, and the concept of trust with a parent or a trusted family member. And I'm going to walk you through all 4 of those. So first, the language. I deal with body parts all the time in my line of work and calling them what they are. But as adults, it's very awkward for us to call private parts by their proper names. And it's really important that you teach your children that their private parts have names and what they are. It's important that you're comfortable using the word vagina and penis and buttocks and breasts. And the reason why is because kids need to understand what their body parts are, so that if they come to you and say, something hurts me, you know what it is. There are so many stories out there of kids coming to their parents saying, my tummy hurts me, my tummy hurts me, my tummy hurts me. And only later on discovering that what that child really meant is that her vagina hurts her and something had happened to her by someone. But she didn't have the language or the comfort level with her parents to use that language. And it's important that we not make our kids ashamed or embarrassed to use that language. Remember, they're going to be in camp. It's not okay to say to your kid, you can only use these terms when you're talking to me or your dad or me or your mom. It's important for them to know that if there's something that they need to communicate with someone, whether it's a counselor or a division head or a safety person, that they know that it's okay to use the term that applies to that body part. Make them someone who's aware of the language that impacts their body. That's really the first part. The second part is body rules. You know, we have rules about everything. And I liken body rules to this concept of understanding that there are safe ways to touch your body and there are unsafe ways to touch your body. You know, your private areas, oftentimes we describe them as the areas that are covered by a bathing suit. And it's important to be able to say to your kid, we have body rules. No one is allowed to touch your private parts, your areas that are covered by a bathing suit, with the exception of, and that's when you insert. If it's a child that's young and you still have to help wipe them when they're being wiped on the toilet, you can say, except if you need help being wiped, there are certain people that can help you do that. And these are the people that can help you, whether it's your teacher or whether it's me. And this is what it can look like, and this is what it can be, and that's it. Period. You know, when I take my kids to the doctor and they do a full physical, one of the things that happens is, of course, they have to check their private parts. Because I have to make sure, the doctor has to make sure that they're healthy. And before they do that, I always say to my kids, I just want you to know it's okay that the doctor is looking at your vagina right now, because the doctor has to check to make sure that you are healthy and you are safe. But if I wasn't here, or if your dad wasn't here, if there wasn't someone else in the room with you, the doctor would not be allowed to look at your private part. And I always say this in front of the doctor, and inevitably the doctor kind of takes a step back and is like, oh. And then they always turn to the child and say, your mom is right. You should never let anybody touch your private parts unless somebody else is here and it's for a medical reason. And so when you talk about your body rules with your kids, you have to get them comfortable with the idea that there are unsafe ways for people to touch their body, and you want to make sure that it doesn't happen. So no one's allowed to touch your body unless it's a medical reason in a medical office with a parent there, or in specific situations with wiping or having to give a bath. And there's no reason that a grown-up would ever need you to touch their private part. Now, I have had my own kids turn to me and say, ew, that's so gross. Why would a grown-up want me to touch their private part? And my answer to them is, you know what? Sometimes there are people who do weird things. Sometimes there are people who are unwell and do things that aren't safe. We don't do that because that's not okay. And it's okay for you to say to your kid, a grown-up will never need help from a child to touch their private parts. Because if they do, then they are not a well person, and you have to tell a trusted person. Those are your body rules, the concept of something that's safe and not safe. You know, and again, I know there are going to be some follow-up questions to this, but that conversation that you have with your kids about who's allowed to touch themselves or who's allowed to touch them and who they can touch doesn't have to be scary and doesn't have to be overwhelming. Say it like it is, because that's the best way to empower them. The fourth part of that conversation is this concept of secrets. I'm very anti-secrets. And anybody that knows me knows that from a very, very, very young age, I taught my children that they are absolutely not allowed to keep secrets. It doesn't matter if it's their friend that's telling them a secret. It doesn't matter if it's if it's my friend that's telling them a secret. And from a very young age, my parents, my sisters, my friends know that if they use that word secret around my kids, the answer is going to be, we do not keep secrets. We don't use that word. And the reason why you want to take secrets out of the concept of their vocabulary and out of the concept of their reality is because people who prey on children oftentimes create a grooming situation where the child is keeping secrets for that person. Let's do this together. It'll be our secret. Let me give you this thing. It'll be our secret. And effectively, what that person is doing is removing the child from being able to tell anyone unless they think that secrets are bad. And so this constant conversation that you're having with your children should be, we don't keep secrets. Secrets are not something that you keep from your mom and dad. Last summer, I got an email from my youngest daughter's camp counselor. She said the weirdest thing happened in day camp today. And my youngest daughter, I think, was 3.5 at the time. She said we were in circle time, and there was a music teacher that came in to teach the kids something about music. And all the kids are sitting around, and they're really excited about it. And the teacher says, guys, do you want to hear a secret way to play this song? And my 3.5-year-old literally stood up, raised her hand, and said, I can't be here. I am not allowed to keep secrets. No secrets. I can't keep secrets from my mom and dad. Nope, can't be here, can't listen, as only my 3.5-year-old can. And the teacher, the counselor, the teacher didn't really know what to do. And she said, well, you know, it's okay that it's okay, you can be here. This is a secret about music. That's okay. And again, my 3.5-year-old daughter said, no, it's not. I'm not allowed to keep secrets from my mom and dad. I won't listen. Now, the counselor realized that what was happening was really significant, and she actually did take that opportunity to then turn to everybody else and say, you know what? She's right. We do not keep secrets from our mom and dad. Let's call this something else, because you always tell your mom and dad everything. I have to tell you, that was like one of my most proud parenting moments that I've ever had, because it works. It works if you say to your kids, we don't keep secrets. And it's not because you had this big sit-down conversation. It's because it's constant. It's a constant thing. And then your kids will grow up knowing that they don't keep secrets from you. The last thing that you really need to be able to say to your kid is, and this is a hard one, no matter what you tell me, no matter if you did something bad or you think you did something bad, I will never, ever get mad at you for coming to me and telling me anything. I don't care if you did the worst thing in the world. If you come to me and tell me something, whether it's something that makes you feel unsafe, or something that you think you did that was wrong, or something you're embarrassed of or ashamed of, I promise you, you will never get in trouble. And that's something you have to really believe, and you have to buy into. It means if your kid comes to you and discloses that they did something mean to a friend, your immediate response isn't necessarily to punish them, but to deal with the situation. Show them that if they come to you with something they're embarrassed or ashamed or scared of, you will not get angry at them. And the reason why this is one of the most important aspects of you being empowered as a parent and empowering your child is because typically abusers make children feel and manipulate them into thinking that their parents will hate them, that their parents will punish them, that the child disclosing this information will destroy a family or a parent. There is tremendous guilt associated with the manipulation when somebody is being sexually abused. You have just taken that out of your child's thought. No matter what, I will never be angry at you. I will never punish you if you come to me and you tell me something, whether you're scared or embarrassed or ashamed or disappointed in yourself. And that's, again, something you have to be able to say to your child constantly, all the time.
Okay, so I'm going to just quickly, because I'm taking notes while you're talking, run through these 4 pieces again, and I think that this is personally very helpful. I'm sure it's really helpful for everybody in the audience. You talked about number 1, giving our kids the language to be able to talk about their body parts. Number two, talking about body rules and what our body rules are. Number three, not keeping secrets. And number four, creating trust, that our kids should be able to tell us things that feel uncomfortable or that might make them feel ashamed. And that we'll welcome that and won't make them feel bad about it. We have about 10 minutes left, so I want to turn to questions that have come in. And if anybody in the audience has additional questions, please send them along, and we'll try to stick to about 2 minutes to questions. We can get through a few before we run out of time. Okay, question one. I hear everything that you're saying, but I'm still concerned that having this conversation is going to scare my child off of going to camp, and I really want her to be excited about going to camp. What do you say?
I say, of course you want your kids to be excited going to camp. Look, do you ever have a conversation with your child that has to do with the fact that they absolutely can't swim unless they know how to swim or there's a lifeguard there? Do you ever have a conversation with your child where you talk to them about fire safety and what to do in the event that a fire breaks out, whether it's in the house or in school? There are scary things that happen in this world, but that doesn't mean that as parents we don't work with them to empower them and prevent things from happening. And I think that if you reinforce the idea that this is about safety, just like making sure you don't jump into a lake if there's no lifeguard there, just like you don't jump into a burning building if there's a fire in camp, just like you don't give a peanut to somebody that has a nut allergy. There are safety prevention things that we talk about with our kids all the time that have potential to be very impactful in camp, and we don't shy away from talking about that. There's no reason why you can't say to your child, remember, people are good. Most people are wonderful. Sometimes there are unwell people, and sometimes there are people that do bad things, but most of the people in this world do amazing things. And most of the time, your smoke alarm is never going to go off. And most of the time, there's going to be a lifeguard there. And if there isn't a lifeguard there, do not go into the lake. Remember that the way that you have this conversation is what makes them feel comfortable. If you talk to them about safety in general, and you talk about all the different aspects of safety, the fear that you're feeling has more to do with whether you're going to be able to convey this in a non-scary way. So remember, most people are amazing and they do amazing things, and I expect you're going to have an amazing time at this camp. And by the way, I spoke to the camp director about all the safety things: sunscreen, water, fires, if there's wildlife at your camp. Just because you're concerned that your kid may be scared about something doesn't mean that we don't talk to them in a calm and very explanatory way. And remember, this conversation is not just about camp. It's an ongoing conversation with you, that you're having with your kid, and you're not starting it by saying, there are people in this world who could touch you, so you need to be prepared. You're starting it by saying, hey, I'm so excited for you to be going to camp. I want to talk to you about a couple different things that I want you to be aware of, because I want you to have the best summer that you could possibly have.
I want to go back to a question was asked earlier, and in a minute, I'm curious what your answer is. If a camp or youth organization has a history of a past scandal, would you still consider sending your kids there? How do you vet a camp that may have a few blemishes on its record?
So I think that it really depends. I think that if a camp, things happen in every single camp. If we didn't work with organizations or deal with camps where things happen, I think there would be a very, very short list of places that we could even go. Synagogues, schools, etc. That being said, to me, it's a red flag. I want to know, what have you done as a camp to make sure that A, this doesn't happen again, and what did you do when you were dealing with that situation, and what has changed? Ask the director. Say, I know this happened 4 years ago. What did you do at the time to deal with it? Was what you did correct or incorrect? Was what you did good or not good? What have you changed since then? and then ask them those lists of questions. If you're getting the brush off, if you're getting the feeling that they don't have good answers, they don't have good protocols, and they're really uncomfortable with your questions, or if the response is something like, oh, well, that was, that was a blemish and a blip, and it would never happen again, then I would be wary about sending my kid somewhere there. I'd be wary about sending my kid to anywhere where a director would respond to me like that. Just because something bad happened at one point doesn't mean it can't be fixed. We want to give camps the opportunity to fix them. And the more parents that ask these questions, the more accountability there will be.
Great. This takes things in a slightly different direction, but I think it's an interesting question. In brief, how do you address counselor on counselor misconduct? Is the potential of non-consensual touch and or date rape?
I'm sorry, say that last part again?
I.e., the potential of non-consensual touch and or date rape.
Sure. I mean, you could also just call it rape, right? Because you're not necessarily on a date with someone in camp. So I think that this is all part of the training. As a counselor going to camp, no means no, and it's important that part of the protocols of what's dealt with in staff training is not just counselor to camper, but also counselor to counselor, or alternatively, staff member to staff member. Because remember, you could have staff members where the age varies. You could have a 35-year-old division head and you could have a 17-year-old counselor. That is something that absolutely should be dealt with in staff training, and that should be a question that you ask the camp director under the rubric of what kind of training do you do for your staff? Do you talk with the fact that no means no? Do you speak about the fact that there is something called consent and there's something that's not consent? And some camps think that they don't need to talk about this because they are camps where men and women are not allowed to touch. It's important to remember that just because there's a rule that people aren't allowed to touch doesn't mean that they aren't going to, and also doesn't mean that these incidents can't happen between members of the same sex. So you have to keep that in mind.
Okay, we've got about 4 minutes left. Let's see if we can get through a couple more questions.
Sure.
Everything that has been said so far is very helpful in terms of making it difficult for an abuser to groom a victim. But what about an abuser who simply takes advantage of a situation to force himself on the child? How can one prevent something like this?
Well, that's a huge question in the sense of when you say force, I think you're making a differentiation between force and grooming. And typically when it comes to kids, there is going to be some sort of grooming process. That being said, in a camp setting, you deal with a force situation in the same way because you're preventing it or you're working to prevent it by making the assumption that there is someone in camp that may act this way. We are training our staff and we are taking it seriously to explain what is allowed and what isn't allowed and how we're doing it. And as parents, we're ensuring that that camp is doing that, and we are talking to our kids not just about specific situations in camp. Because, there was someone who asked about making sure my kid isn't fearful. I can guarantee you that if you go through every scenario with a child of what could happen to them, that absolutely will terrify them. And it will terrify you. Remember to take a step back. This is not about saying to our kids, if someone forces you to do something, scream and run, get out of here. If somebody forces you to touch them, scream and run and get out of here. This is about giving your kids the tools to deal with these situations, whether it's in a force situation or it's something that you might categorize not as force. Remember that kids who are empowered and kids who have the terminology and the language and the knowledge on how to deal with this will fare better and typically will not be a target as much as somebody who doesn't.
Let me ask you one more question. We've got 2 minutes left.
Sure.
Body rules, a lot of what you talked about seemed oriented towards younger kids. What do you recommend in terms of body rules for teens?
So I think that that's it's a similar conversation in that hopefully you'll be having these conversations with regard to body rules from the time when your kid is really young. Obviously, how to talk to teens about this specifically could be an entirely new session, and one of the things that I'm going to do is provide some resources to JOFA so that you can look at some of those resources that are available online and see the difference in how you can speak to a teenager versus a younger child. And I think that the concept of an unsafe versus a safe touch is something that can parlay any age group. It's about how frank you want to be with your child and how comfortable you're willing to be when you have this conversation. Remember the idea that a grown-up doesn't need you to touch their private part, and a grown-up should never be touching your private part, is something that impacts every single age group. The difference is that as kids get into adolescence, there's going to be a different level of experimentation with kids that are of similar ages, and that really is a separate conversation. So because I know that we have literally a minute left, I'm going to provide some resources to JOFA to be able to send you to read up on that.
Okay, fantastic. I think we're just about out of time, so let me say thank you to Rahel for sharing your experience and wisdom, and thank you to JOFA for giving us this great opportunity.
Yeah, and on behalf of JOFA, I just want to thank both Rahel and Menachem for sharing their experience with us. And as Rahel noted, we'll be sending out resources to anybody who has registered, and this webinar will also be available online. We'll be sending you that link, so please feel free to share it with your colleagues, with camp directors, with your parents, or with your children, with anyone who you think should be watching this webinar. And we hope that you will continue to stay engaged with JOFA through our mailing list and through our social media, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. So thank you.